She doesn't look like she belongs in first. Probably some mistake. The words weren't whispered. They were spoken aloud, casually, like an observation about the weather. The attendant didn't flinch. Neither did the man in the navy blazer who had just walked into the VIP boarding queue. Instead, he adjusted his platinum watch and nodded subtly in agreement. A woman in her mid-40s stood just a few feet away, holding a leather-bound planner, a soft travel bag by her feet. She said nothing. She didn't need to. She had heard this before, more times than she could count. Have you ever been judged based on your appearance before you even spoke a word? If you believe discrimination has no place in 2025, hit that subscribe button and share this story, because corporate accountability starts with us refusing to stay silent. Her name was Arielle Stokes, though few in the terminal recognized her. That was by design. Arielle didn't travel like a high-profile CEO. She avoided private jets when she could. She preferred flying commercial, sitting in the same lounges, breathing the same recycled air, and watching the same human theater unfold at boarding gates around the world. Kept her grounded, reminded her of where she came from. But today, the quiet storm of subtle prejudice was swirling again. She had arrived early, hours before her flight, and quietly checked in to the airline's executive lounge at JFK's Terminal 4. The receptionist had barely made eye contact, offering a mechanical smile before scanning her boarding pass. No small talk, no welcome greeting. She didn't mind. She'd chosen a quiet seat in the corner, tucked behind a column, where the sun spilled in from the runway. She sipped green tea and skimmed through a PDF on ESG governance. Her company was preparing for an acquisition. She was leading it. Billions were on the table. And yet, here she sat, invisible. Time ticked on. She made her way to the VIP boarding area as her flight, JTA 948 to Zurich, began its pre-boarding sequence. That's when the tone shifted. First, the agent's eyes flicked up, uncertain. Then came a forced smile, tight at the corners. And then the hesitation. "Ma'am, I think there's been a mistake. This lane is for first-class executive access only," the gate attendant said without checking her pass. Arielle paused, not out of surprise, out of exhaustion. She handed the pass over. "I believe I'm in the right place." The attendant's fingers hovered over the scanner. Still not satisfied, she glanced to her colleague behind the desk. "She's in 1A," the other woman confirmed, sounding mildly confused herself, but the tone still held that question. "How?" Moments later, another man appeared, tall, white, wearing a tailored blazer and dripping with entitlement. Without being asked, he stepped into the lane. The attendant smiled at him immediately. "Welcome back, Mr. Gallagher." And then, almost instinctively, she turned to Arielle. "Ma'am, would you mind taking a seat in the priority waiting area for a moment? We have an overbooking situation in first." There it was again. Polished, polite, packaged in policy. But Arielle knew what it was. It wasn't about the seat. It was about her. Her skin. Her understated presence. Her refusal to perform power through material excess. To them, she was an anomaly. A deviation from their mental mold of what success should look like. She looked at the seat assignment again. 1A. Her initials even matched. The irony wasn't lost on her. Still, she nodded and stepped aside. 5 minutes passed, then 10. She watched as other first-class passengers boarded. Smiles, greetings, champagne flutes gliding through the curtains. No one called her name. And then she saw it. Mr. Gallagher being led onto the plane and ushered into her seat. 1A. The place she had chosen for its proximity to the cabin door, perfect for early exit. For efficiency. For someone who runs an empire. She didn't argue. Instead, she opened her phone, scrolled through her messages, found the one she needed. Her chief operating officer had sent it earlier that morning. Board confirmed. Final approval on Zurich deal signed. You're officially chairwoman of the new joint entity. Fly safe, boss. Boss. That word lingered. Because right now, the people at this gate didn't see a boss. They saw a black woman standing quietly. Alone. supposedly out of place. And yet, she would be landing in Zurich to finalize a merger that would absorb one of the region's largest tech consultancy firms. Ironically, a major contractor to the very airline now quietly disrespecting her. Ariel typed a short message to her executive VP. Need internal contacts for Global Flight HQ. Something happened. Discreet for now. Then she walked to the podium, politely asked for clarification about her seat. The agent avoided her eyes. Apologies again, ma'am. There's been a change. The system reassigned your seat. You've been moved to business. Not bumped down to coach. Not completely removed, but demoted. The kind of move airlines make when they think the person won't make a fuss. But they had miscalculated. Not because she was going to raise her voice, but because she didn't need to. Ariel smiled faintly. Understood. She accepted the new boarding pass and walked away, not toward the plane, but back to the lounge. She had 5 minutes before final boarding. Just enough time. Within minutes, 3 messages were sent. One to her legal counsel, one to her chief of staff, and one to a partner board member with deep ties to aviation regulators. She wasn't seeking revenge. She was seeking accountability, because what had happened wasn't just about her. It was about how systems continued to operate in subtle shadows, treating presence as privilege, power as profile, and skin as a metric for service. And for the crew on this flight, the clock had already started ticking. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have guessed, was that Ariel Stokes wasn't just a first-class passenger. She was about to become the reason their entire management structure unraveled before landing gear even lifted off. The soft chime of boarding echoed through the terminal, but to Ariel Stokes, it sounded more like the quiet hum of disrespect, stretching thin over time. As she sat in the lounge, just moments after being reassigned from 1A to a downgraded seat, she wasn't angry, not in the way people often expect. There was no clenched jaw, no slammed phone, no raised voice. Instead, there was a kind of silence that only certain people understand. A silence born from repetition. A silence that knows the language of being dismissed without cause. Of being unseen while standing right in front of someone. Back at the gate, the final boarding call buzzed overhead. Passengers rushed past the priority lane, flashing glossy boarding passes and sliding into the aircraft without a second glance. Gate agents smiled, collecting documents like they were dealing cards at a high-stakes table. No one spoke Ariel's name. No one asked if she still wanted to board. Her new business class seat sat waiting, far behind the one she had reserved, paid for, and confirmed 3 times in advance. But the airline had made a choice, a quiet, collective one. A choice to treat her as an afterthought. What they hadn't realized yet was that other people had been watching. 2 rows behind the check-in counter, an older couple had seen it unfold. They didn't record. Not yet. But the husband whispered to his wife, "That wasn't right." A teenager nearby had her phone out from the moment the initial overbooking line had been delivered. She'd filmed the exchange just out of curiosity. Then again, just in case. It only took 1 post. Within minutes of Ariel walking away from the boarding zone, that clip hit a small travel vlog's Instagram story. No names, no context. Just a caption. This woman got removed from her seat so a white businessman could sit in first. Airline says overbooked. You decide. And just like that, the machine turned on. Online, it spread quickly, reposted by followers, stitched into TikToks, embedded in travel forums and DEI groups. The woman in the clip was calm, dignified, silent, and yet the outrage wasn't. People had seen enough of these scenes to know the script. And this one was unfolding perfectly. Inside the plane, Mr. Gallagher settled into one, legs stretched out, champagne in hand. He had no idea he was seated in the eye of a storm. Back in the terminal, Ariel finally stood, collected her belongings, and made her way toward the gate once again. Her face showed no urgency, no trace of emotion, only precision, like someone who had read this chapter before. As she handed her boarding pass to the agent, something flickered across the woman's face. Recognition? Regret? Uncertainty? Ariel didn't wait to find out. She boarded and walked through first, eyes brushing over the seat where she should have been. The man in her place didn't even look up. The flight attendants didn't acknowledge her. Her reassigned business seat was fine. It was adequate, but it was a symbol and it reeked. What the crew didn't know, what the gate staff had overlooked, was who exactly they had just dismissed. Ariel wasn't a celebrity. She wasn't a social media personality. She didn't have a viral face or a publicist waiting to pounce. But she was powerful. Quietly, thoroughly, irrefutably. She led a global consultancy firm with ties to Fortune 100 companies, including 3 that were partners with the airline in question. One of them had just signed a $300M fleet contract renewal. Ariel had negotiated that deal herself. She knew every clause, and she knew exactly what pressure points to apply. The aircraft taxied. No one on board had any idea that above the clouds, a conversation had already begun. One of Ariel's team members forwarded the incident video, unprompted, to the company's Diversity and Compliance Council. Came with a message. Looks like this is our Ariel. No press. Yet. Elsewhere, hashtags started trending. Hashtag wrong seat right story. Hashtag business not welcome. Hashtag flying while black. Ariel didn't post. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The world was already filling in the blanks for her. Inside the aircraft, the cabin crew laughed lightly, still unaware. To them it was a routine flight, but the pilot's comms had already received an unusual ping, something about incident review and real-time evaluation of boarding practices. The flight crew exchanged a glance. This wasn't standard. Back in business class, Ariel sat still, not reading, not watching, just being. She wasn't waiting for justice. She was watching the system unravel itself. It's a strange thing, how silence can disturb power more than shouting ever could. Because when someone doesn't fight back, when they don't argue, it leaves room for self-reflection. Or panic. And panic was beginning to bloom. Someone from ground staff had called their supervisor. The video was now circulating internally. An internal flag had been raised on the gate's operations. And someone in airline PR had started receiving texts marked urgent from executives asking who was on that flight and why the web was starting to buzz. Still, Ariel sat, unmoving. She'd given them all the rope they needed. Just before the aircraft pushed off from the gate, a gate agent ran toward the jet bridge with a flushed face, phone in hand. She didn't get far. The door had already been sealed. Too late. The chain reaction had begun. Somewhere between New York and Zurich, as Ariel closed her eyes and leaned back, executives at the airline's headquarters were scrambling for answers. HR flagged it. Legal flagged it. Communications flagged it. Then the compliance team stepped in and connected the final dots. The woman in the video, the CEO, the dealmaker, the one whose seat had been quietly reassigned to preserve appearances for another, more visibly fitting passenger. The one whose company was now reconsidering its aviation partnerships. And the one who hadn't said a single word, yet had triggered a complete internal investigation before the plane even left U.S. airspace. But for the crew, they were still in the dark, laughing, smiling, serving drinks, unaware that once this flight landed, they would no longer be crew at all. As Flight JTA 948 sliced through the night sky over the Atlantic, inside the cabin, the world was changing. Ariel Stokes reclined her seat just enough to close her eyes, but not enough to rest. She wasn't here to rest. This journey had become something else, something symbolic, something systemic. Down the aisle, the flight crew continued in their rhythms. Wine poured, meal carts prepped, business class small talk politely entertained. No one had been briefed. No one had been warned. But turbulence was already brewing. Not in the skies. On the ground. By the time the aircraft passed over Newfoundland, the video of Ariel's removal had been reposted over 10,000 times. At first, it was a small ripple, travel pages, diversity advocates, minor influencers. But something about this incident, this particular moment, had caught fire. Maybe it was the silent elegance of the woman being removed. Maybe it was the way the gate agent had looked through her, not at her. Or maybe it was because people were tired of seeing this movie play out with different names and the same script. Across LinkedIn, the clip began appearing with professional commentary. Industry leaders weighed in. Some recognized her face. Others recognized her presence. And then, someone said her name. Ariel Stokes? The comments lit up. Wait, the Ariel? Isn't she the woman behind the Echelon-Spheris merger? She's one of the top 5 black women CEOs in the world. What was she doing flying commercial? That last comment stung, unintentionally. What was she doing flying commercial? As if humility were a flaw. As if visibility in shared spaces somehow invalidated power. But this was exactly the point. This was why she flew like this. To observe. To stay rooted. And sometimes, like today, to uncover how the world still measured worth. Somewhere in Boston, Ariel's chief of staff, Zoe, was in her apartment with 2 monitors and a half-finished chai when the alert came through. The firm's internal media tracker flagged Ariel's name with a sensitive trending topic, notice. Zoe's eyes widened as she saw the clip. It wasn't labeled. No one had doxed Ariel, but the context was loud. She dialed Ariel's number out of instinct, then paused. She's still in the air. Instead, she sent a secure message to legal and comms. Potential PR risk, high priority. Involves CEO. Recommend protocol review immediately. Tracking down incident location and airline involved. But legal wasn't far behind. Their team had already caught wind. At the same time, Ariel's inbox was quietly filling. Not with apologies. Not yet. But with confusion. From her own people. One executive assistant had messaged. Just saw the clip. Please tell me this wasn't today. In Zurich, a junior executive at Spheris, one of the firms Ariel's company was acquiring, had sent the video to his director with a single question. Isn't this the woman we're about to report to? Back in New York, inside the airline's Midtown headquarters, a very different kind of meeting was starting to form. The social media team was the first to escalate. The algorithm had flagged the trending content around the hashtag wrong seat right story. Sentiment analysis showed a 78% negative lean and rising. They didn't know the woman's name yet. But the footage was real, and the boarding gate number matched their JFK logs. Internally, the message was cautious. Potential discrimination incident caught on video. Passenger removed from confirmed first-class seat. Reassigned to business. Video now viral. Crew unidentified but likely on Zurich route. That message was forwarded upward. Fast. The airline's director of public relations looped in legal. HR was CC'd. Within 30 minutes, the internal escalation had reached the VP of International Operations. He responded with a single line. Do we know who she is? They didn't. Not yet. But they were about to. It wasn't until someone in compliance connected the name Ariel Stokes to a background check run 2 weeks prior, part of an enterprise partnership renewal, that the penny dropped. Ariel's company, Stokes Advisory Global, was not just a corporate partner. It was the partner. They advised on risk, handled strategic procurement, and consulted on board-level equity policies, including, ironically, anti-discrimination training for airline personnel. She was not a disgruntled customer. She was the woman who wrote the rules they were supposed to be following. Panic moved fast. In the Zurich control office, a message arrived from corporate headquarters. Identify crew on JTA 948. Prepare for full incident review on arrival. This is a Category Red. Category Red wasn't code for passenger safety. It was worse for the airline anyway. It meant brand safety. It meant someone powerful had been wronged, and consequences were coming. But still, on the aircraft itself, the air remained deceptively calm. The crew joked about their weekends. The captain prepared for descent. No one on board yet knew they were carrying a storm in seat 3A. Ariel, for her part, never opened her laptop. Never made a scene. She simply wrote notes in a leather journal, her pen moving slowly, deliberately. Each note was not a reaction. It was a reminder. This was not about revenge. This was not about calling for heads. It was about responsibility. How could an airline speak about inclusive travel in its marketing campaigns and then, without a blink, displace a woman from her paid seat based on unspoken assumptions? How could systems still behave like this? Polished prejudice hiding behind protocol. The irony twisted in the air. Her firm had just completed a white paper for the aviation sector titled Modern Skies. Equity in elite travel. And yet, here she was. Case study in motion. Ariel didn't need the world to defend her. She needed the world to watch, to witness what happens when quiet dignity meets unchecked bias, and when those who built the very foundations of power are told they don't belong in the building. By the time the wheels touched down in Zurich, the story had breached the surface. Major outlets were requesting comment. Industry blogs were chasing the source. Someone on Reddit had posted a side-by-side of Ariel's LinkedIn photo and the boarding video. Confirmation complete. It was official. They had removed the wrong woman from the right seat. And now that seat, was about to cost an entire crew their careers. The plane touched down in Zurich just past sunrise. A soft morning haze hugged the tarmac, and airport vehicles moved with quiet precision. Inside the cabin, passengers stirred awake, the dull ache of long-haul travel tugging at their bodies. But beneath that hum of routine, something extraordinary was unfolding. Not that anyone on board knew it yet. In the cockpit, the captain had received an unusual message during descent. An instruction to remain on board after landing, along with the entire cabin crew. No explanation given. Just a formal request marked, "Executive review required." The flight attendants exchanged glances but said nothing. These things happen, sometimes, usually tied to protocol breaches or passenger complaints. They assumed it would be minor. It wasn't. By now, Ariel's name had become something more than a hashtag. It had become a flashpoint. Overnight, she'd gone from anonymous subject to publicly identified figurehead. And with that, her silence became its own weapon, more powerful than any outrage. She hadn't tweeted. She hadn't posted. She hadn't given a statement. But the corporate world was speaking on her behalf. Before her plane even rolled to the gate, 3 separate client partners from Ariel's consulting firm had contacted the airline with demands for clarification. 2 had already requested a formal review of their contracts. 1, a defense industry logistics provider, was threatening to pause negotiations altogether unless the airline addressed the issue immediately. Why? Because Ariel wasn't just an executive. She was the architect behind some of the most ethically progressive supply chain frameworks in Europe. She didn't carry clout by shouting from rooftops. She carried it by being the person everyone else turned to for permission to move. At 7:04 a.m., Zurich time, the airline's global HQ convened an emergency meeting. On the surface, it looked like any other crisis response: tiered updates, scenario mapping, press team alignment. But this wasn't just PR. They knew this went deeper. Someone at the table had already reviewed Ariel's client file. They had seen the full scope of her reach. Her name wasn't just on one deal, it was tied to 12. And 5 of those contracts had equity compliance clauses baked in, clauses that Ariel herself had pushed for. She didn't just advocate for accountability. She wrote it into the fine print. In the Zurich operations room, the ground supervisor was handed a list of crew members from flight JTA 948. His instructions were direct but unnerving. Hold them for post-flight debrief. Notify local HR liaison. Await further direction from executive response. It was not normal. Meanwhile, Ariel disembarked with the rest of the business class passengers. Her pace was unhurried. Her expression unreadable. No cameras greeted her. No officials swarmed. She exited through the jet bridge like anyone else. But every movement she made was already being watched, just not by the public. Security footage had been pulled. Audio recordings reviewed. A full internal timeline was already under construction. Someone in compliance had initiated a policy gap review before breakfast. Still, no apology had come. No one had contacted her directly. Perhaps they were still unsure of how to handle her. Or perhaps they were terrified. Back in London, Stokes Advisory Global had convened its own leadership call. Ariel's chief strategy officer and 2 legal counsels were already laying out options, ranging from a quiet conversation to a full-blown contractual freeze with the airline and its subsidiaries. They weren't out for revenge. But the tone had shifted. Because when a company that proudly markets inclusive airspace quietly demotes a black woman from her rightful seat while allowing another, more acceptable profile to take it, that's not just bad optics. That's systemic failure. And when that black woman also happens to own equity in your reputation, the consequences become existential. The airline's board chair received a call just after 8 a.m. from one of their largest institutional investors. The message was calm but clear. If this is what your definition of elite service looks like, we'll be reevaluating our alignment. Suddenly, this wasn't just about Ariel. This was about trust. The kind built over decades and burned away in 5 minutes at a boarding gate. In the Zurich crew lounge, the team from Flight JTA 948 had been separated. Each was asked to provide written statements. No one explained why. There was confusion. Some felt defensive. Others began to remember small details. Phrases said at the gate, glances exchanged, choices made without full understanding. One attendant, still in uniform, scrolled through her phone and saw the video. She recognized her own posture in the frame. Her own eyes, flicking past Ariel like she didn't belong. Her hands trembled. For many of them, this was the first time they realized what had happened wasn't procedural. It was personal. They hadn't just made a mistake. They had confirmed a bias publicly and against the wrong person. But it wasn't just about title or status. That was the deeper pain. If Ariel hadn't been who she was, if she hadn't had the power to shake this system, would anyone have noticed? Would anyone have cared? It wasn't the removal from 1A that was the story. It was the assumption that a black woman couldn't possibly be the rightful owner of that space. And that assumption had cost them everything. Back at headquarters, the airline's legal team was preparing for impact. Internal emails were being scrubbed, statements reviewed. But it was already too late. Ariel's team hadn't released anything to the press. Not yet. But they had forwarded a formal complaint to the Civil Aviation Authority, citing visible racial bias and breach of contract. The language was cold, clean, lethal, and unlike public outrage, it couldn't be ignored or spun. The ripple effects were now waves. Industry associations were watching. Clients were reconsidering. Internal employees were murmuring. And all it had taken was one quiet act of disrespect. A moment so routine for some, so painful for others. Ariel herself? She sat quietly in the back of a black sedan en route to her Zurich hotel. She had said nothing. Not to the airline. Not to the press. But her silence had already spoken volumes. Because sometimes the most powerful thing a woman can do is refuse to shout, especially when the world expects her to. She simply walks forward and lets the system fall behind her. By mid-morning in Zurich, the sun was high enough to cast long, sharp shadows across the tarmac. But for the airline's senior management, it wasn't the light that was disorienting. It was the growing darkness of uncertainty. The aftermath had begun. Inside a minimalist conference room with glass walls and cold steel chairs, a dozen executives sat around a long table, each staring into the cold truth of what they'd failed to see coming. On the far wall, a projection screen displayed a running live dashboard. Trending hashtags, media mentions, customer sentiment scores plummeting like stock prices in a crash. The numbers weren't just red. They were bleeding. In the center of the chaos, Ariel Stokes. A single name with no public statement, no social media post, and yet, she had triggered what the press was already calling a boardroom earthquake. What made this different was not that a black woman had been disrespected by an airline. That story was tragically familiar. What made this different was who Ariel was, and how she responded. She had not tweeted her frustration. She had not stormed the gate in anger. She had not threatened legal action publicly or leaked to the press. Instead, she had waited, and that silence was far more terrifying, because the ones who knew her, those who'd worked with her, understood what her silence meant. The decision had already been made. The review wasn't coming. The response wouldn't be performative. The consequences had already begun. Quietly, strategically, at Zurich Airport, just hours after landing, 5 members of the Flight JTA 948 crew were escorted to a secure HR facility. The official language was procedural, Post-flight compliance debrief. But the tone had shifted. Each crew member was asked to recount their version of the incident. This time, the questions were more direct. They were no longer looking for context. They were confirming accountability. Some deflected, citing protocol. Others admitted to vague assumptions, claiming confusion at the gate, an unclear booking update, or a misinterpretation of a seating override. But none could explain why they had treated the passenger in question as someone less worthy of dignity. Because they hadn't been following procedure. They had been following instinct. Instinct shaped by years of quiet conditioning. Who gets welcomed, who gets questioned, who gets seated at the front, and who gets bumped. And this time, that instinct had betrayed them. Back at the airline's global headquarters, 2 mid-level managers in the customer experience division were let go without notice. Their internal Slack threads, joking about mistaken upgrades, and referring to Ariel in crude, coded language, had been screenshotted, reviewed, and terminated. No press release was issued, no names given. But people inside the company knew. Whispers spread quickly. One by one, the system had begun to eat itself, starting with the most exposed, the most careless, the most obviously culpable. But the reckoning didn't stop there. The VP of Diversity and Inclusion, a woman known for glossy corporate presentations and internal workshops, found herself summoned to a board audit. Her performance wasn't in question, her silence was. Where was the oversight? Why had someone of Ariel's status not been flagged for special handling, if not out of respect, then at least out of pragmatism? Why was the first-class manifest not reviewed? Why had the boarding team felt confident enough to remove a black woman from her seat without double-checking her profile? The answers were damning. Because the real problem wasn't a single decision. It was a culture. A culture dressed in professionalism but rotten with unchecked bias. A culture that rewarded efficiency over empathy, intuition over investigation. The airline CEO, a man who had built his brand around progressive luxury, now faced the biggest crisis of his tenure. He had not met Ariel in person, but her name had crossed his desk twice before. Once during a proposal to partner on sustainable equity initiatives, and again when his own leadership coach cited her as a model for quiet, transformative leadership. And now her silence was costing him everything. The board issued a demand for a complete top-to-bottom audit of customer service training and executive oversight. Contracts were frozen. Meetings postponed. At least 2 major investors had paused fund disbursement. The fallout wasn't measured in tweets or trends anymore. It was measured in millions. Meanwhile, Ariel sat in a quiet corner office at the Spheris headquarters in Zurich, the city skyline glowing behind her. She hadn't spoken about what happened. She hadn't needed to. Her focus was on the merger, the acquisition, the future. But the ripple she had created could not be ignored. Not by the airline, not by the media, and not by the thousands, millions who saw themselves in her. Because this wasn't just about Ariel. This was about every traveler who had ever been questioned instead of greeted. Every professional who had been overlooked in a room they had every right to lead. Every person who had been told they didn't look like they belonged, even when they owned the building. The irony was profound. Ariel had spent decades working to dismantle systems of inequity from the inside. She had advised Fortune 100 CEOs, trained leadership boards, restructured power dynamics in corporations across 5 continents. And yet here, at a gate in JFK, she had been reduced to her appearance. Stripped of title. Dismissed. But that mistake, their mistake, had done what years of policy drafts could not. It had forced accountability. Not through outrage, through consequence. And perhaps that was the lesson. The most dangerous thing about racism is not its violence, it's its subtlety. The way it cloaks itself in professionalism, in customer service, in vague misunderstandings. But when that subtlety meets the immovable presence of someone who understands power, true power, there's no cover left to hide behind. By day's end, 6 employees had been dismissed, a 7th placed on indefinite suspension. 3 airline partners had issued statements of concern. Internal memos leaked. Still, Ariel had not spoken, because she didn't need to prove anything. She had already proven what the world needed to see. that when systems refuse to change, dignity does not need to scream. It simply waits for the right moment, and lets gravity do the rest. The news cycle didn't trickle. It erupted. By the following morning, global headlines echoed the same story in different languages. Black CEO removed from first-class seat sparks corporate reckoning. From Zurich to Johannesburg, Atlanta to Melbourne, the incident had transcended industries. It wasn't just a travel story anymore. It had become a symbol, a mirror held up to every sector still pretending that equity had already arrived. And yet, amid the media frenzy, one figure remained curiously quiet. Arielle Stokes had still not spoken. No interviews, no op-eds, no carefully worded tweets. She declined every request. She ignored every invitation. She let the silence stretch, not as avoidance, but as discipline. While the world filled with noise, she waited. Because words spoken too early can feel performative. And Arielle had never needed to perform her pain for validity. Behind the scenes, however, movement was constant. The airline's PR team issued a generic statement. "We are reviewing the unfortunate seating issue and reaffirm our commitment to diversity and inclusion." Fell flat. The internet called it out for what it was, damage control masquerading as reflection. Then came the reckoning. Customers began sharing their own stories. Microaggressions, boarding zone stares, random bag checks, seat upgrades revoked with poor excuses. There was a deluge of testimony from professionals, mothers, students, and frequent flyers who had quietly carried humiliation without proof, without platform. But now they had one. Arielle's story had cracked the surface, and the flood poured out. It wasn't rage that defined the response. It was exhaustion. People weren't just angry, they were tired. Tired of apologizing for existing in spaces they had earned. Tired of being told their experience was a misunderstanding or worse, that they were playing the race card. Arielle had done none of that, and yet her story validated thousands. In newsrooms, the debate shifted. Anchors questioned how many boardroom diversity metrics were symbolic. Panels argued over the difference between intention and impact. Editorials dissected the structure of gatekeeping not in policy but in perception. Why had no one questioned the white businessman who had taken her seat? Why had staff defaulted to assuming she didn't belong? Why had it taken a woman of such visible achievement for the world to finally listen? These weren't just rhetorical questions. They became catalysts. Several major airlines, sensing the pressure, launched internal reviews. Training modules were revised overnight. Boarding policies were rewritten with oversight panels. Within a week, for competitors had implemented anonymous discrimination reporting systems and pledged to audit their premium customer experiences for bias. None of them mentioned Arielle by name, but everyone knew. Meanwhile, in corporate America, the fallout grew more uncomfortable. Executives across sectors were now asking themselves, would this happen in our lobby? At our off-site? At our own front desk? HR departments scrambled to prepare response protocols. Internal Slack threads exploded with staff demanding accountability beyond hashtags. Because if a black CEO could be erased from her seat in minutes, what did that say about everyday employees with no spotlight, no platform, and no recourse? And still, Arielle said nothing. Her silence had become strategic. Not absence. Not fear. A form of leadership in itself. She was not interested in being a viral sensation. She was not here to soothe guilt. She was not here to be anyone's teachable moment. She was leading, quietly, deliberately. That changed exactly 8 days after the incident. In a move that stunned the public, Stokes Advisory Global released a white paper titled The Quiet Gate: How Bias is Enforced Through Silence. At its center was an open letter from Arielle. A single page, understated in tone, devastating in message. She didn't describe the incident. Not directly. She described the moment after, the stillness when humiliation settles in, when the mind goes quiet and the body forgets how to feel dignified. She wrote about how leadership is often mistaken for volume. How she had learned long ago that her power wasn't in proving her worth to anyone. It was in refusing to let them define it. And she ended with a single line that would echo across boardrooms for years to come. I wasn't removed from a seat. I was shown what still occupies the one next to me. Assumption. The letter did not call for firings. It did not seek apologies. It simply demanded reform. Real, structural, inconvenient reform. The document outlined 5 core demands, not to the airline, but to every corporation claiming to value diversity. 1. Audit boarding or entry experiences where assumption-based decisions are allowed without oversight. 2. Create escalation pathways that prioritize impact over hierarchy. 3. Include bias interruption training in all elite customer or client interaction roles. 4. Shift diversity KPIs from hiring statistics to measurable experience equity. 5. Acknowledge that unspoken harm is still harm. Design systems to prevent silence from becoming complicity. The white paper was downloaded over 2 million times in 48 hours. Harvard Business Review requested to feature it in its entirety. For international consulting firms sought partnership immediately. Government transport agencies cited it in upcoming regulation proposals. Ariel had not given the world drama. She had given it direction. And in doing so, she changed the conversation from a viral moment into a living movement. 1 week after the white paper's release, the airline's CEO resigned. He had not been publicly accused of wrongdoing, but his departure spoke volumes. His statement, unlike earlier ones, was unpolished and pained. He admitted the company had failed to build a culture where appearance was not currency. He accepted that this wasn't an isolated incident. It was a culture that needed dismantling. And as for the crew, most were no longer employed. A few had been reassigned to non-customer-facing roles pending retraining. Internally, the airline created a compensation fund for passengers who had experienced discrimination in the past 5 years. It wasn't redemption, but it was a start. In an exclusive interview weeks later, her only public appearance on the matter, Ariel finally spoke. When asked why she hadn't reacted at the gate, why she hadn't demanded immediate justice, she smiled faintly and said, "Because I don't dismantle systems with outrage. I dismantle them with structure." The interviewer paused, then asked her if she forgave the crew. Ariel nodded gently. This was never about them. Because it wasn't. It was about a gate that has existed for centuries. Unmarked, unspoken, but always guarded. A gate that measures worth through filters never made visible. And now, because one woman chose silence over spectacle, dignity over drama, and action over outrage, that gate had been kicked open. Not with noise, but with truth. A month passed. Time, as it often does, dulled the edges of outrage in the public consciousness. The headlines shifted, new controversies claimed attention, and the digital storm that once engulfed an airline began to quiet. But behind the curtain of viral memory, something deeper had taken root. The woman who had once been quietly stripped of her seat was now leading conversations at the highest levels of power. And not because she had forced the world to listen, but because she had refused to perform for its attention. Ariel Stokes had returned to her routines, her calendar once again filled with board meetings, strategy sessions, and international forums. But something had changed, not in how she worked, but in how the world moved around her. She was no longer underestimated. Not because of the incident, but because of how she handled it. She had not demanded recognition. She had offered clarity. She had not spoken of vengeance. She had offered vision. And in doing so, she became something rare in a world obsessed with outrage. An architect of measured reckoning. In the weeks that followed her open letter and white paper release, industry after industry began auditing their unspoken biases. Tech firms re-examined how they screened VIP access for product launches. Legal firms questioned how they allocated executive attention to clients of color. Luxury travel groups revised their premium client protocols. But perhaps the most surprising shift came from within the airline industry itself. 3 global airlines adopted Ariel's 5-point framework. Not as PR, but as policy. One international carrier announced a leadership exchange program, placing senior executives in frontline service roles for 1 week every year to observe how power shaped interaction. Another invested in AI tools to flag patterns of biased treatment at check-ins and boarding gates, something long overdue. And the airline at the center of the original incident? They didn't just issue apologies or donate to a cause. They rebuilt. They quietly hired Ariel's firm to redesign their executive accountability systems. There was no press release, no celebratory partnership announcement, just a quiet acknowledgement of failure and the beginning of restitution. But for Ariel, the reward was not in reputation or praise. It was in returning with her head held high, not because she had defeated her detractors, but because she had elevated the very standards by which dignity is measured. That became evident during her next international flight. She was again booked in first class. Same airline, same gate. When she arrived, the boarding lane paused. Not for spectacle, but for silence. There was no excessive attention, no curated welcome, just respect, just recognition. The agents scanned her pass without hesitation. No questions, no glances, no second-guessing. And as she stepped into 1A, the seat she had rightfully booked weeks prior, it felt not triumphant, but correct. As if the world had finally caught up to the truth she'd always carried. Inside the cabin, no champagne was offered with forced enthusiasm. No smiles laced with guilt. Just service. Quiet, competent, professional. And that was all she ever wanted. She didn't need to be celebrated for enduring injustice. She wanted a world where her presence no longer needed to be justified. That flight, like many before and after, was uneventful. No headlines, no clips, no firestorms. But beneath the surface, millions of people were still thinking about her story. In classrooms, her letter was being discussed in leadership courses. In corporate offices, DEI training referenced her case as a turning point. In homes, parents shared her story with their children, not as a tale of victimhood, but as one of commanding grace. She had done what few could. She had changed an industry not by burning it down, but by holding up a mirror and letting it reckon with its own reflection. And she had reminded every silent observer, every person who had once been dismissed, displaced, or doubted, that dignity doesn't shout. It stands. It walks forward. And it waits for the world to catch up. Legacy is rarely loud. It's rarely viral for long. But it lingers in systems rebuilt, in conversations shifted, in minds awakened. And Ariel's legacy was now etched not just in policy, but in possibility. Some would call her calm dangerous. Others would call it divine. But everyone, no matter their stance, was now forced to reckon with the truth. When quiet power speaks, the world listens. If the story moved you, if you've ever felt unseen in places you've earned the right to stand tall, then share this. Because justice isn't always dramatic. Sometimes, it's a quiet seat reclaimed without a word. Hit that subscribe button to support powerful storytelling like this. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Has silence ever been your loudest answer? And remember, corporate accountability starts with us. Together, we hold the systems to their promise.